Right, Amaterasu. Amaterasu is definitely one of the more abstract goddesses. Like the way she plays and the way her ability works, things are not quite as obvious as they seem. And even in terms of like describing how Amaterasu works, I was struggling really to figure out the best way of like elucidating how I think you're supposed to perceive, like Amaterasu deck lists and the cards they have in them, and why Amaterasu likes certain cards and hates others. And eventually I realized that kind of the best way to get into it is to start by just comparing her to a goddess that's a lot simpler. And that's Zeus actually. Zeus basically is when you put something on the board, you gain extra devotion, right? Zeus is all about throwing lots of cheap units on the board, gaining all this bonus devotion and just exponentially increasing in terms of devotion generation far faster than your opponent can keep up with you. You basically just rush them down. So when you're reading Zeus and you see a Greek unit such as Minotaur is probably the best example here. Like Minotaur, as far as Zeus is concerned, of course, Minotaur isn't a 4-2, it's a 4-3, and it has incredible value. Like Zeus literally just wants to throw all this cheap stuff on the board, and it's super amazing. Amaterasu works almost counterindicative to that. She's almost the opposite of Zeus. Amaterasu doesn't benefit from you putting things on the board. Like like she's actually worse at that than other gods because every time you put something on the board, you lose a card from your hand. In a way, Amaterasu doesn't like playing cards, if you understand what I mean. What this means is that if you take this same card, Minotaur, right? In Amaterasu's hand, it generates one devotion. If you put it on the board, it generates two. What this actually means, though, is that Minotaur only generates one more devotion than when it's in your hand. So, from a certain perspective, like any permanent in Amaterasu decks actually has a -1 to it. Like with Zeus, this is a 4-3. But with Amaterasu, this is actually a 4-1. You're only really generating an extra 1 point of devotion from it. And as soon as you put it on the board, it can be messed with. Your opponent can Artemis arrow it, or like Armageddon or Seaquake, and you lose that generation. But while it's in your hand, you get that devotion generation, and your opponent really can't like mess with that at all. The only exception is Ningyo, which of course forces you to discard cards. That is the only card in the game really that can do that, that can actually mess with your hand at all. So effectively, Amaterasu doesn't actually like cards like this. She's the opposite of Zeus. She hates cheap cards. There is no point. Like, Amaterasu finds nothing remotely attractive about the idea of having a hand filled with, like super cheap cards, like Egyptian statues, Minotaurs, Medusas, all this stuff. There's some part of an Amaterasu that looks at that and is kind of like, well, if the card is in my hand, I get 33% of its devotion generation anyway. If I slam it on the board, maybe it Seaquakes, and I've just lost that forever. These just aren't attractive cards to Amaterasu, right? That's kind of like the first point. That's the way of breaking into Amaterasu, as far as I'm concerned. That's kind of the way of explaining Amaterasu, like as an icebreaker, like just to get into it. She is abstract. It's not like super obvious, but to some, like even that, right? Like you read it and it does seem obvious, but at the same time, it doesn't seem obvious. Like it's hard to put together that actually Minotaur isn't a 4-2 for you; it's a 4-1. I think that's like a super important point. Secondly, sometimes I like recommend card switches or card swaps. Amaterasu is a Japanese mythology goddess. You have access to all the card packs. So I'm not going to like recommend any card switches here. I just don't think it's necessary. You have these cards. You have the capability of like getting all these cards. She's Japanese mythology, guys. Like I shouldn't have to recommend a change for you. So I'm going to go through the deck as I normally do. Like I kind of go through it mostly card for card and just explain why I think it's super attractive for Amaterasu. And then I kind of like go back to like the overall deck and just talk about it again, like in terms of its like the general way it works. I should also mention just before we start, right, because of like the previous point, like she hates small cards. Of course, the other side of that coin is Amaterasu loves big cards. She wants cards that like do a lot. Her card slots are valuable. She wants like every time she uses a card, that's almost painful for her. It like the card has to be something that does incredible things. So things like Seaquake or Armageddon are more valuable for Amaterasu because a single card slot, like just losing a single card from her hand can achieve so much that's very attractive for her. Like she can just hold it until she needs it, and then when she uses it, she's only using up a single card slot. That's amazing. Yeah. So just talk about it. Yeah, she's kind of like she's not small ball. She's like a big ball goddess. She likes big cards. She's just not interested in cheap. She wants expensive. Right. So I've talked about like the overall idea behind Amaterasu. Right. So I'm gonna go through it. Rise of the Pharaoh. At first, like Amaterasu is very abstract and it's not immediately obvious. And this is kind of like a great demonstration. She's so unclear and it's hard to explain sometimes. It's hard to even like get a grasp of her. And I'm still not like 100% sure I've got like a good grasp of her. But Rise of the Pharaoh, when I first saw this, I thought this was terrible for Amaterasu because it reads as like you generate for devotion, right? Like you pay 16, you get 20, so you've made for devotion. And my line of thinking when I read it was Amaterasu doesn't want this at all because she can just hold this card, like she can just hold a card in her hand and generate for devotion. You know what? Like, so Rise of the Pharaoh gives you for devotion, but you lose the card. So by spending it, you lose one devotion generation a turn, but you only get four devotion from the card, and then that's it. Like you've lost the card. So after 4 turns, you've made a loss, and this could just be like any card. This could be any card, and like it could be a card that does something for you, if you know what I mean. Like compared to like if this was, I mean, anything really. If this was a Fujin, I mean, of course I've got four of Fujin, but you know what I mean. Like if it's just like a Fujin, I could hold it in my hand until I need Fujin, and while it's in my hand, it's generating devotion for me. So Rise of the Pharaoh, I kind of like, I don't understand. Like, surely this is less attractive. It's amazing in some decks, but for Amaterasu, it doesn't work at all. Like that doesn't make sense. It's terrible. Like these cards are actually kind of like blank cards. Like you just burn them. If you've got 16 devotion, then with most gods or goddesses, you just burn the card, and it's effectively like an empty card. It doesn't actually affect the board state or like card advantage or hand or the grave. It just gives you extra devotion, so it doesn't do anything for you. It's just a card that you burn instantly, and Amaterasu then goes, right, well now I've got -1 devotion generation a turn. But by the time I got to Japanese mythology, I realized it's the other way around. You hold this card because it is generating devotion for you, but it also gives you that bump like it does for every other god and goddess, right? Except it's a little bit better for Amaterasu in a way. She can hold this card, and if she never has to use it, she never has to use it. But she's more than happy to just hold the card. That's the point. Is she's happy to hold this card, have devotion generation. But for any point, you're at 16, but you need to do Seaquake, you can use it. Like you just hold the card. And if you just need that bump just to get there, just like something a little bit extra or Armageddon, that's perfect. Like if you're at 23 and you need to Armageddon, you Rise of the Pharaoh. But this card isn't actually bad for Amaterasu. I was only working out in terms of, if you play the card, and with other gods and goddesses, you just play it, like naturally, you just like, yeah, like you pay the 16, you get 20, you make a 4 devotion profit. You don't tend to like hold Rise of the Pharaoh in your hand so much because other gods and goddesses have like cheaper decks, and you just burn it straight away, so you can put more on the board, so you get more devotion generation. With Amaterasu, it's not that. It's just that she literally holds this card in her hand, and it's a difference maker. That time that she really needs to Seaquake and she just can't quite afford it, you've got a Rise of the Pharaoh. If your opponent's just overwhelming, you've got it. You've got that Earthquake, you've got whatever you need to do. Maybe your Ningyo needs to attack one more time, because it only costs 4 to attack with a Ningyo. Then, Rise of the Pharaoh. But it's actually good for Amaterasu. It's actually better than other goddesses. It's so strange, right? It somehow like She's just very kind of like uniradical and weird. Like other goddesses seem to like move in straight lines. Amaterasu moves in kind of like this curved line. Rise of the Pharaoh actually is good for her. It's so hard. Like even as I'm trying to explain it, I feel like I'm just repeating myself. But I don't know if it is possible to like perfectly explain this card any better. I can't do it. Izumo Taisha, right. The other side of this, right, is Amaterasu is big bull. But the other side of that is she needs to have the cards that she needs. Similar to Hades, kind of, where Hades starts slow, Amaterasu starts slow. Like, she's not going to throw down a bunch of stuff on the board, generate loads of devotion, and rush down. She's not a rush down goddess at all. She needs to dig. So, and because she likes cards in her hand as well, like of course you can have like 4 copies of Everflowing Sun. That's not really enough. You need to dig through your deck more. You cannot be Amaterasu and not have the answer in your hand. You know, if you're going to play like this big ball style and dedicate very, very little to the board, when you need to Seaquake, you really need to Seaquake. Like, your opponent has 4, 5, 6 units on the board. They're now generating 20, 30 plus devotion a turn. You need, like, it's the same as Hades. Like, Hades starts slow. He cannot afford not to have it in his hand, which is the same reason. Like, both Hades and Amaterasu love Izumo Taisha for similar reasons. It allows them to dig. And, you know, the value of Mummy in here is, of course, because you can discard it and then play it from your graveyard. Amaterasu actually likes Mummy a little bit more than Hades does. Just because Hades likes having Greek units in the grave. And you like Izumo Taisha with Mummy. You like that interaction because, of course, you discard the Mummy, then you can put it on the board. That's helpful for Hades because the way he reads Taisha is you discard the Mummy, you just draw 1 card, plain and simple. Like your hand size is effectively the same because you can still play the Mummy; it's still in your hand. With Amaterasu, you still discard a card. Like you draw a card, discard a card, and her hand size does matter. So even though it's in the like the Mummy is in the grave, the fact that it's not in your hand means that is 1 less devotion generation. But Amaterasu likes Mummy for a different reason. She likes the fact that it's actually a terrible deal for her when it's not in the grave. She doesn't actually she doesn't want to put it down because this is a small ball card. But once it's in your grave, the calculation's different. If it's in your hand and you put it down, you've gone from 1 devotion generation to 2 devotion generation, and it means nothing to you. Once you manage to cycle the Mummy into your grave, you actually get the full card. If I'm explaining it, like it's not coming from your hand, so you don't lose that devotion generation. And Mummy is now an actual 4/2 for you that is still doing the things that I value Mummy so much for, which is just she's like a devotion value trade machine. You put it down for 4, your opponent attacks it with. I mean, like Ningyo's got an amazingly cheap attack, but she has to attack Mummy twice. That's 8. It only costs 4 to put Mummy down. It goes to the graveyard and you just put it down again. You keep making these positive trades. It's possible to have play like 4 copies of Izumo Taisha as well. Because the joy of Izumo Taisha is you can afford to have too many copies of it and have it clog up your hand. Because you put down an Izumo Taisha and then you just discard the other Izumo Taishas. Like in some ways, like Izumo Taisha doesn't, even when it's clogging up your hand, it's not clogging up your hand because you just get rid of them. It's not a problem. You're not making any real loss there. You really need it to dig. So you do need it kind of like in your starting hand, you're opening a few moves, if you can. Amaterasu really, really needs to dig. And this is a card that you can actually afford to have like 3 or 4 of. I've kind of, yeah, I mean, I don't need to go on a bit more than that. Like, I've already explained. Like, just plain, she has a few options here, but I actually think like some of these options aren't really options. I've got like I think Everflowing Chalice is a bit of a joke. I think it's just a win more card. I think it's pointless. But there's only so much card draw in this game right now. It's basically Everflowing Sun or it's Everflowing Chalice. Like these are the 2 like draw cards. There are some others like Naiku draw a card, but I think that's terrible even on Izanagi. A lot of these are just Kirin as well. Like I think this is terrible. 12/4 draw a card. means that, you know, as far as Amaterasu is concerned, this is now a 12-5. You know, like, you draw a card, so now you've got one extra devotion generation because you've got an extra card in your hand. But that would only make the Kirin a 12-5. That's still a terrible deal. Like, that's not a good deal. That's a stupid deal, man. Like, that's really, really bad. Naiku is a joke. It's really bad for Amaterasu as well. The line of thinking is kind of like, well, you draw a card, so you've got one devotion generation. Then it draws another card, so you've got two devotion generation. Then on the third turn, it draws you another card. You know, so you're adding devotion generation. It's giving you more and more devotion generation. So it goes from like a 15-3 to a 15-4, a 15-5, 15-6. In that respect, the only problem is this is way, way, way too expensive. By the time you can put down a Naiku as Amaterasu, you know, like, there are other things. Like, Seaquake is only 4 more than that. And you need this. You don't need this. This is, you really need card draw, but there's just so much of it, and the options are terrible. So Izumo Taisha, actually, I think is like super good value. You obviously don't play it for devotion generation. That's the other thing, is most of the cards, right, you read them, like Minotaur, you know, it's just the example I'm going to use all along. And you're like, well, Amaterasu doesn't really want to slam it down because she gets less divine devotion generation. And Izumo Taisha only has 3 devotion generation. So in that respect, it's like a small ball card. But Amaterasu never is interested in the devotion generation from Taisha. That's the thing. It's the cycling. This could say 0. I would still consider playing this card. It's not about the devotion generation. It's just about the fact that she needs to cycle. So I've got 3 copies. You could have 4. It'd be fine. Loki's trick as well. Starter matches, Amaterasu more than any other goddess is kind of like, well, I don't want to put down anything. I haven't got anything. I would rather, you know, just like get the maximum value from each individual card slot. And Loki's trick is a single card slot card that can just stop everything your opponent does. Like, they can have like the entire board covered. And then Loki's trick means if they don't have any way of like getting to you that turn, that's it, it's done. It buys you a turn, and every single turn that like the game goes on, Amaterasu wins. This also only costs you 2 extraction. I should probably talk about this now, right? Amaterasu is engaged in like a lot of stalling tactics, and because she plays like this big ball style, there will be turns where you have like leftover devotion. She is more susceptible than almost any other goddess to soul extraction. Like, soul extraction is actually a real killer, for Amaterasu, because she's happy with like empty boards, you know, boards where she hasn't really committed too much. She'd rather keep things in her hand. Your opponent is almost always generating more devotion generation than you, because, you know, like, they put the Minotaur down and they're getting the full amount of devotion generation. They want to slam their board down, and they're not affected by having a smaller hand size. Amaterasu only has a base generation of 1, and the rest of her generation comes from her cards in hand. So your opponent is more than happy to slam down cards, and they get the full benefit of those Minotaurs and those Medusas. Amaterasu can't win that game. She just can't win. Like, if you throw down things on the board, Amaterasu will lose. Her base generation is too low. So your opponent almost always has like a bigger board than you until the end game. You know, they've got more devotion generation than you almost always. Which means a lot of the time you don't have enough on board to like get Seaquake in a single turn. You might have like 1 or 2 units on board. You can't equal 19 in a single turn. You know, but Amaterasu isn't that bothered. She's having to keep cards in her hand until she needs them, and then she'll make a value play. But like I said, that does mean she's very susceptible to these turns where she's got like 11, 12, you know, 13 devotion, and she just doesn't want to commit anything to the board. She could put something down, but she's not really getting the maximum benefit from it, and she doesn't want to use a card for absolutely no reason, or give you a target for like your Eclipses or your Artemis Arrows. So she does get caught out a lot with like 11, 12, 13 devotion. Soul Extraction, she's back to square one. This card is horrible. Like, this is a natural counter to Amaterasu. We should just get out of the way right now. Like, Loki's trick as well. You play Loki's trick, and then you don't tend to play anything else that turn. And then you go, right, well, I had like 16 devotion. I played Loki streak. Now I'm at 14 devotion. They commit more to the board, and we've got more devotion than them. Then we Armageddon, and you know we're just positive because the board's now cleared, but we've got a massive hand size because we've only used 2 cards in 2 turns, and you know we've been building up and cycling and you know Everflowing Sun. Right, Seaquake doesn't need much explanation. I've had to refer to it early altogether. Seaquake is kind of like a big ball card. It does a lot for you. Yeah, your opponent has like 3-4 units on the board with the cost of just a single card slot. The cost of just 1 devotion generation a turn. Amaterasu can clear you know those units. Seaquake does a lot for you. Amaterasu loves this card more than most goddesses do, which is why there's 3 copies. And again, you could go up to 4. It's legitimate. You just don't want to like squash your hand. You'd rather have like, it's not the card that you want immediately, but it's a card that you have to have within the first 3, 4, 5 turns. You must have this available to you. You just don't want it clogging up your hand. So I'm at 3. I think that's like you don't need to explain the card any more than that. Everflowing Sun is kind of like a no-brainer with Amaterasu. Because as far as she's concerned, the card reads pay 5 devotion this turn, plus 1 devotion generation. Yeah, you draw 2 cards. One of those cards, of course, replaces the Everflowing Sun itself. Then you get plus 1 devotion generation from that other card. Your hand size gets bigger. This is just plus 1 devotion generation for the rest of the match. Basically, that's how it reads. So you'll make your money back in. Oh, let me think about this. Well, I mean, 5 turns is effectively, you know, like how long it takes. Amaterasu should be able to last 5 turns, rather easily. But just in general, you have to have this. Like, there's just not enough card draw in the game right now, and you need to dig. That's the other side of it. You get plus 1 devotion generation, but in some respects, it's also kind of like a blank card. And it's just, you replace it with 2 other cards in your deck. You don't have a deck of 40, you have a deck of 36 if you've got Everflowing Sun. This isn't an actual card in a way. Like, it doesn't actually affect the board or any, like, it doesn't do any damage or any, you know what I mean? Like, there's no actual impact. It just gives you more cards. The board isn't affected at all. So in that way, it's just like an invisible card. It's a non-existent card. It just replaces itself. It's a cantrip, yeah? So you actually have 36 cards in hand. This draws 2 cards, so you could actually argue it's lower than that. It's 32 cards you have like in your deck, which is fantastic. You'd rather have a thinner deck of Amaterasu. Soul Extraction. Because I play insane mode, of course, Soul Extraction. There are going to be times where your opponent starts with 11 devotion, you know, or you know higher. Honestly, I mean, towards the end of the game, you have bosses that have like 8 bonus devotion just from being on insane mode. You need to make like positive soul devotion trades. You know, like soul extraction is one way of making it a good devotion trade. It's efficient. It costs you 2 devotion. It takes all their devotion. If they've got 8 devotion, you've made like a 6 devotion gain. This card's a little bit different for Amaterasu, as is true for everything, because it is a card slot. So you pay the 2 to take the 8. You've made 6 devotion from them, from your opponent, but you've also lost 1 devotion generation a turn. So in some ways you could say, you know, like after 6 turns, you know, it equals out. But 6 devotion, you know, like the number of things you can pay, like buy of 6 devotion. That's the thing, is it takes 6 devotion this turn. So actually it equals out even for Amaterasu. It's just not as positive as with other goddesses, because you know, like that's an Itsukushima. So if you hadn't soul extracted, they put down Itsukushima. They've got 3 devotion generation. By soul extracting, they put down Itsukushima a turn later. They've lost, you know, like 3 devotion generation for a turn. So from that perspective, soul extraction is an extremely positive card. By taking their 8 devotion, you lose devotion generation, but you also hinder their ability to put down a board faster. They put down a Itsukushima a turn later, which means they get that devotion a turn later, which means their board develops a turn later, you know, like quote unquote a turn later. So their devotion generation is actually seriously impacted by it. That's just the way Amaterasu has to see these things is with a lot of other goddesses, if I see they've got like 4 devotion, I'd still be like, yeah, I pay 2 to take your 4. I've made a +2 devotion gain. So with a lot of other goddesses, that's great because they don't care about hand size as much. With Amaterasu, you need something, you know, like you can't just make like this positive devotion trade. It's actually got to be a meaningful trade for Amaterasu. More than most goddesses, soul extraction, you've got to be just like a little bit greedier with, or a little bit more patient, or a little bit riskier with. Just simply going, oh yeah, well they've got 3 and this costs 2. I'd make a 1 devotion gain isn't enough, isn't anywhere close to enough for an Amaterasu deck. So soul extractions in all my decks, you've got to play it a little bit different with Amaterasu though, is all I'm saying. Time Reflow, I don't like having 4 copies of this card, but you need to dig. You need to be able to have the things that you need when you have them. 3 copies just isn't enough. What Amaterasu needs is reliability. She needs to be able to rely on being able to get what she needs when she gets it. And this just means when you get screwed, it's not quite so bad. You know, if you have a really, really bad start as Amaterasu and your hand is bad, like really bad, because Amaterasu cares about hand size, she doesn't like to mulligan. It kind of feels like you can't mulligan. So what happens is you have to do the best you can with what you've got. If you get like, I mean, screwed is like just having like Mummy, Fujin, Ningyo in your hand, and you just can't play them. You can't really do anything with them. You really don't want to play Mummy. You want to play Izumo Taisha and then put the Mummy in the grave so you can then get the full devotion from it. Kind of. It's abstract with Mummy. You know, like Amaterasu is just kind of weird in that respect. But Time Reflow, you have to take that risk of clogging up your hand just a little bit. Because if you've only got 1 copy of Everflowing Sun, you need the capability in a game to go Everflowing Sun, Time Reflow, Everflowing Sun, Time Reflow, Everflowing Sun. If that's your only course of action, you have to be able to do that. You need 4 copies of Time Reflow. If you need to buy time and every other copy of Loki's Trick is at the bottom of your deck, and you just need to like buy yourself 2-3 turns, you are hopelessly behind. Your opponent has like outvalued you so badly. They've got this massive board. This is a capability that sometimes, you know, like it's the only way of hanging on is Loki's Trick, Time Reflow, use the Loki's Trick again. If it's the only copy of Loki's Trick you have, you must have this ability to, you know, just turn it into 4 copies of Loki's Trick. Sometimes you need that, plain and simple. Like sometimes you just need that as Amaterasu. She can't fight people just piece for piece, board for board. She just can't do it, guys. Like she just cannot do it, guys. She really cannot. You need the capability just to be able to do that. Mummy, again, like Mummy is the kind of card like I've already talked about because you have to talk about it in terms of Taisha. I've talked about how devotion generation's a little bit weird with Amaterasu. The way you have to think about devotion generation is very, very different. Hand size matters to her so much. If Mummy is in your hand, you really don't want to play it if you can possibly help it. Is giving you 1 devotion generation a turn while it's in your hand. And your opponent just can't stop that devotion generation. As soon as you spend 4 devotion and put it on the floor, you get +1 devotion generation a turn. But mummies themselves are very disposable units. They're just supposed to be like these little devotion trading efficiency machines. But they're not that efficient for Amaterasu unless they're in the grave already. Playing it from the grave is the efficiency for Amaterasu. Playing it from the hand, like when you work it out, like it kind of works out in so much as we'll just use a Ningyo, you know, like it kind of works out in so much as you can say, right, well, Ningyo spent 8, I can spend 4 for Mummy, and then they and put it in the way again, and then next turn they'd have to spend another 8 to get rid of this Mummy because Mummy's blocking their ability to attack my goddess. With Amaterasu, what happens instead is if you play it from your hand and put it on the board, you've spent 4, they spend 8, your turn, you don't get the 2 generation from the mummy, and you don't get the 1 devotion generation from it being in your hand. So you lose 3 in a way, if that makes sense. Like, you've lost 3. So even though it's weird, like, you look at Ningyo and like, well, that cost 8 and that cost 4. No, if you play mummy from your hand, because of the way it works, you actually only kind of like make a devotion gain of 1. It's, like, that's kind of the thing. It seems very counterintuitive, but after playing like all the way through campaign, that's how it works. And it's also, okay, in this campaign, right, I got my backside handed to me by 4, and I didn't put it together. But actually, with Amaterasu, even it like against 4 more than any other goddess, like Amaterasu struggles against 4, like when you're playing mummy, because mummy 4 of course gets 2 devotion for destroying units. Mummy is just like this disposable chaff unit. You take it out of your hand, put it on the board. 4 destroys it. You've now got 1 less devotion generation because your hand size is smaller, and 4 has just gained 2 generation from destroying it. Suddenly, like, this Ningyo attacking the mummy is positive, and 4 is beating you, and suddenly you're getting your backside handed to you by 4. It took me ages to find it. Like, I was winning against every other like god in Norse mythology, with the exception of possibly Loki, but I just was having a horrible time against 4. And normally I don't. Normally I think 4 is like the weakest out of the Norse mythology. Like, so easy to beat. Really, really easy. But with Amaterasu, it took a long time for me to like kind of do the maths. And when I was playing it out, realise, oh, like, 4 actually comes out ahead here. Even like with any other goddess, you could still play that. Even against 4, like, mummy is okay. But with Amaterasu, playing mummy into 4 just does not work for you. It just does not, like, it does not turn out well. You can't do that. It's so strange. Um, the desire to like discard mummy with Taisha is so high. You do not want to play it from your hands. You're really not getting anything out of it, or barely anything, I should say. Right, Fujin. The ability tends to be like kind of irrelevant, but this is the kind of like medium to high range. I mean, we've already said like Amaterasu doesn't really like the super cheap units. We'll just call them like low range or early game units, yeah. As a general rule, like, Amaterasu's monster game or creature game starts in the mid. She doesn't like putting down cheap units. She'd rather just hold her hand together and jump straight to mid game, like mid units. So Fujin is an 11-5, of course, because it's a card slot. When you play it, you lose 1 devotion generation, so it actually reads as an 11-4. The reason it's a big ball card is because it's a 1040 that has stats of 5-3. Only 5 to attack is very, very good value for money. Like, you kind of work out your devotion generation, and in terms of like destroying units and how much value you're getting, you work it out as like damage per 10, and 5 damage per 10 is very, very solid. A 1040 that is 5 damage, 5 devotion per 10 is extra. Like, this is a very solid card for Amaterasu. If if you get in a situation where you hold on Armageddon, Fujin, and nothing's on the board except this Fujin, you've basically won. It moves fast, it attacks fast, it's really, really tough to deal with. The actual ability isn't a big deal, it's just that this is a card that actually has like a great stat line. Getting 40 health for 11 devotion is good value for money. It's actually amazing. Like, it's some of the best value, like, per health. This is some of the best value you can possibly get. Chimera is more expensive. Only Yuki Honor, I think, is cheaper for 40 health. I could be wrong about that, but everything else, like Kraken, I mean, there's no point like listing them all. Honestly, just paying 11 devotion for something that has 40 health. The other thing is Amaterasu loves big ball cards, right? So she will Seaquake, and the fact that Fujin has 40 health is more relevant to Amaterasu than it is for most goddesses, because all you have to do is Fujin Seaquake, and Seaquake takes care of almost everything, but it's not going to take care of your Fujin. So the Fujin's still on the board, and that is surprisingly valuable for Amaterasu because that's just a 2-card trade. And you've suddenly got this 10/10 that's 5 devotion per 10 on the board. The board's clear. It only costs you 3 to move a square. It's a problem. It's definitely like this is often where the tides change. Amaterasu tends to lose at the start of a match. You can't, like I've already said, like when it comes to like early game throwing things on the board, Amaterasu hates that. She does not want to play that game. So your opponent almost always has like a bigger board than you, more devotion generation than you, until you can clear it. You can do, like you can get this like big this big clear, or just these big cards in, like these big value cards. And just Fujin's ability to like survive your big value cards is invaluable. Ningyo is kind of the opposite, but kind of the same in so much as you're paying for a 14/5, but actually it's a 14/4, as I've said before. But the ability is surprisingly relevant, because Amaterasu tends to clear your opponent throws everything down. This is often what happens. Your opponent throws things down. The things it can throw down are the things it can throw down. That sounds silly, but like it can't throw down an Osiris at the start of a match, right? Osiris costs 30 devotion. It can't do that. So what happens is they'll throw down all their stuff, try and generate, do the best they can. You end up like with Armageddon or like your Seaquake or whatever. Their board is cleared. What are the cards that they have in their hand? It's the cards they couldn't play, right? Like Osiris. So even though Ningyo, I wasn't that big on the ability, and I'm still kind of not like when your opponent has like a big hand size, it doesn't matter. In the early game, the ability doesn't really matter. But in the mid to late game, the ability to discard a card from your opponent's hand is very relevant because the cards they have in their hand are the cards they couldn't get on the board. They were too expensive, or they were too awkward or clunky. And Ningyo's ability to just, or they're too niche. Like if they've got a bigger board than you, they're gonna hold on to their Armageddon, right? But if Armageddon and then you Ningyo and they've only got like 3 cards in hand, you've got good odds of throwing their Armageddon away. And since you've now like reversed the situation and Amaterasu is out base devotion generating because she's got like a nice big hand. I mean, let's talk about this, right? Base generation for every other goddess is 6. That's the highest it can be. Like some goddesses, of course, like Zeus only has like 5 devotion generation, but the highest they can have is 6. So Amaterasu needs 5 cards in hand. At 5 cards, she's got higher base generation than any other goddess in the game. Like whoever her opponent is, with the exception of herself, she has high base generation. She just needs 5 cards in hand. So after Armageddon, if it's just you and your opponent looking at each other, doesn't matter what it is. It really doesn't. Poseidon, Ra, it doesn't matter. If you Armageddon and nothing's on the board except your goddess and their goddess, and you've got 5 cards in hand, Amaterasu at that point is devotion generation positive. She's beaten her opponent. Which means that you are going to start asserting your will on the game, and it's you that's going to start building up the board. You're going to have the superior board, and it's their turn to be like, oh my god, I need to Armageddon, I can't handle this, and they're going to try and get into the game. Yeah, I've like skipped slightly ahead to Armageddon, but that's because like Ningyo is so important in terms of it. Like in some ways, this card doesn't make sense, but if you think it through and you play out the game, you find the ability to discard the card from your opponent's hand. When they've only got one card in hand, Ningyo is at its most effective. Whatever that card is that they held in their hand through all this time is almost guaranteed to be a bomb. Like, that is a card that could have changed the tide. And Ningyo has just screwed your opponent so hard. Oh yeah. In other respects, though, like paying 14 devotion for a 4 devotion, like that's terrible devotion generation. I mean, the cards in an Amaterasu deck kind of like it's similar to Taisha. Like, the cards in an Amaterasu deck, it's not about their devotion generation, because Amaterasu generates devotion all on her own. She doesn't need that really. That's not what you're looking at. Like Fujin 2, I've already said, like paying 11 for 5 generation, which is actually 4. That's not like a positive. These cards aren't about devotion generation, because Amaterasu can do that all on herself. She's like completely self-sufficient. Unlike most other goddesses, Amaterasu really doesn't need, you know, doesn't need you to do that for her. She'll take care of that. You need to focus on the other aspects of the game. And Ningyo is that. The discard can be devastating, but even if not, you don't care too much about this terrible devotion generation stat line. You care about the fact that it's a 4/4. We've already talked about Fujin being like crazy good value at 5. Well, Amaterasu is 20% cheaper in terms of its, its damage per 10. 4 devotion per 10 is incredible. Like, this is some of the best value you can find in the entire game. It really is. It's mind blowing. That is so good. That is really good value. Susanoo is like an 820, but that is actually 4 per 10 as well. Susanoo used to be in the deck, but it's more expensive and it's not doing the things that you really need, to be honest. It's just not good enough. Armageddon, I've already talked about. It is weird, just come back to this point. It is weird because like when we started, I'm pretty sure like in Greek mythology, the deck looked quite different. And as over a time, things took a very weird turn, because normally what happens is in Greek mythology, the deck is built a certain way and we think it's good, and then as time goes on we like streamline it and we make it like leaner and meaner and more efficient. That's what happened with Hades, is we had to make it like faster, and lighter. With Amaterasu, it's like completely the other way. We started with like stuff like Itsukushima, and then we just dropped it. We were like, oh, like once we thought this through, we were like, this isn't the card. Like even Fushimi, this isn't the card. It's crazy. It's weird. Amaterasu actually, as we went through mythology, got heavier and heavier and heavier. And now we have only like Mummy in terms of like cheap cards, early unit cards, except we never want to play it early. It's not an early unit card for us. Like, what is our cheapest permanent here? Like 8. Our cheapest permanent is an 8. It's an Izumo Taisha that only gives us 3 devotion. Like the deck, it's like an interesting growth, like evolution of the deck through time until we reach this point. But Amaterasu likes playing big ball, and the deck just got bigger and bigger and bullier. Yeah, 3, like this is kind of like the evidence though. Like 3 copies of Seaquake. In a lot of decks I only have 2. 3 copies of Armageddon. That's, for a lot of goddesses, that is crazy. That is absolutely, like, why would you need 3 copies of Armageddon in a deck? But with Amaterasu, it makes perfect sense. One, it's a big ball card, and you love big ball cards, and this is one of the biggest, bulliest cards of all. It destroys everything, the whole board, absolutely everything. Resets Hell's status too, which makes the Hell matchup a joke. This is like the definition of a big ball card. 2, I've already said, like, Amaterasu needs to find what she needs to find when she needs it. If your opponent builds a board and you just don't have the Armageddon, that's it. You've lost the whole match. You've lost that. Like, It is that simple. It really is that simple with Amaterasu. You must have these cards. You must dig. You must have the Everflowing Suns, the Taishas. You must like time reflow your Everflowing Suns. You will find situations where you have to time reflow Everflowing Sun, time reflow Everflowing Sun, because you need to find this Armageddon. You need to find like this earthquake, or this Seaquake, or the Loki's trick. You have to. It's not like a question. You will lose. As Amaterasu, you will lose if you cannot get them. So 3 copies of Armageddon makes sense. It's almost like it clicks. Like this actually makes so much sense for Amaterasu. But with other goddesses, like 3 Armageddon, I'm gonna have a look at my other decks just after this quickly. I can guarantee they don't have 3 copies of Armageddon. Earthquake as well. Most of the time I don't need it, but just occasionally your opponent throws down, like a couple of Fushimis, and it's just like a nice, easy devotion value trade. Like they throw down 2 Fushimis for 16 devotion. You play Earthquake for 18. You made a 2 devotion loss, right? Actually, no, because Fushimi generates 5. So they would have made 10 devotion generation next turn, which you've just ruined for them. So it's actually a positive trade for you. You don't mind that trade at all. That's a very positive trade. The explanation of like Earthquake into 2 Fushimis and how it's actually a positive trade for you is also the explanation of why Mummy isn't a positive trade for you sometimes. Like this Mummy Ningyo interaction, which I find fascinating and is kind of only true in Amaterasu decks. It's the reverse with Earthquake into Fushimi, or Earthquake into, like Walls of Asgard or whatever. Right, call to arms. This is one of your win conditions. As a general rule, Amaterasu is going to beat you in terms of like economical advantage, similar to Hades in a way. She is just going to generate more devotion than you. In the late game, her hand is bigger. Her card per card quality is higher than yours. Like if you draw 1 card a turn and you get into the late game and of course you only draw 1 card a turn. You get to the late game and you've got very few cards left in your hand. Just on average, the card that Amaterasu is going to draw is going to be better than the card that you draw. I was about to say if that makes sense, but of course that makes sense. Like if she's drawing Ningyo and you draw Minotaur in the late game, of course Amaterasu is going to beat you, and this tends to be like how she wins. Amaterasu just wins through economical advantage and card value advantage. The average value of her cards is higher than the average value of your cards, so you might have an advantage at the start of a match, but as soon as like your hand size gets low and you're relying on what you draw, there's no comparison. Amaterasu will beat you this way. But Call to Arms gives you a second win condition and it gives you a second value trade. The Call to Arms is good in like a lot of decks. I actually really love this card because it transforms cards that only deal 10 attack into 20 attack, and 20 is the most common health in the game. More things have 20 health than anything else, and being able to destroy them in 1 attack instead of 2 attacks is almost always like positive value for you. You pay 7 devotion, you pay 3 devotion for Call to Arms. Ningyo costs 4, so it's 7 devotion to destroy something. Fushimi costs 8. Like even it's Tsukushima, because of course you ruin their devotion generation next turn, so you've kind of ruined 8 plus 3, but kind of it's not exactly. Kind of you have to kind of work out turn over turn and how likely it would have survived if you hadn't attacked with Ningyo. But yeah, the point is Ningyo though. Like Call to Arms loves cards that have super cheap attack costs. Call to Arms doesn't like cards that are like doesn't like cards that are like Kraken or Fenrir that are like 7 for 20, because that's 3.5 devotion per 10. Which if you Call to Arms like the Fenrir, it becomes 7 for 30. Which you know what? I should have done the maths on that before I actually calculated it. It goes from 3.5 to 7 for 30. Why can't I work this out? 2.3. Yeah, 2.3. But it's if you compare that though to what happens with Ningyo, right? Ningyo is better on Ningyo because of course it only costs 4 to attack. Call to Arms doubles her her value per 10, her devotion per 10. Suddenly she becomes a 20 attack, and it's 2 devotion per 10, which is better than Call to Arms on a Fenrir, which is kind of crazy. Like, you look at, like, you'd think Fenrir would be better, but actually no. Susanoo as well, like, almost every card in the game is more expensive to attack with than Ningyo, and that makes Call to Arms one of Ningyo's favourite cards, and vice versa. It this card turns Ningyo into an end game win condition. Fujin 2 is only slightly worse, but this is a legitimate win condition for you because Ningyo goes from okay, the goddess, their goddess has 80 health, attack 8 times with Ningyo, 4 times 8, that's 32, yeah? 32 devotion is asking quite a lot, but it's not crazy, but that is asking a lot. Call to Arms, suddenly you pay 3, and then Ningyo only needs 4 attacks. So that's 4 times 4, 16, plus the 3, 19. Are you kidding me right now? 19 devotion to kill a goddess is crazy. This turns it into an absolute demon. There is a comparison I always do. I've probably done it in the campaign as well. I'm pretty sure I have, right? But Athena is considered an incredible beat stick. This is one of the best beat sticks in the game. 5 for 20 is great. Those are incredible. That's incredible, right? That is 2.5, devotion per attack. I mean, it goes without saying, right? But of course, 4 for 4 for 20. This is only 2 devotion, so it's a better beat stick than Athena at that point. Athena is vicious. Athena is a win condition. Ningyo is even more vicious. Ningyo is terrifying. Absolutely. This card is so good. This card is so good. And Call to Arms also, not necessarily in terms of goddesses even, but sometimes you've got a Ningyo on board. Your opponent's got, a couple of Greek temples maybe, a Hades statue, just a couple of things, right? And Call to Arms Ningyo clears 4 units, 4 permanents. I mean, 19 devotion isn't asking that much if Ningyo's already on the board, because Ningyo itself generates 5. Amaterasu generates the 1, so that's 6, plus whatever you've got in your hand. Say you've got 5, 6 cards in your hand, you're now at 14, so 14, 15 devotion, yeah, we'll say. So you are only actually 4, 5 devotion shy of this. This isn't asking much. Oh, did you just say 4, 5 devotion? Oh, what's this? Rise of the Pharaoh? This is what I'm talking about. Coming all the way back, right to the start. Rise of the Pharaoh. You hold this in your hand, and just and you're happy with it just being devotion generation. And just occasionally, it'll allow you to pop an extra, Ningyo attack, or it just gives you that little extra you need. Sometimes you just fall short of Armageddon, and Rise of the Pharaoh just gives you that little bit of a bump, and now the board's clear. And the value of Rise of the Pharaoh, this is actually incredible in this deck. This is what I mean. When I first started using Amaterasu, I thought it was bad. Now I've realised that Rise of the Pharaoh is actually a great card. Okay, so I thought it was difficult to explain Hades, but I've been talking about Amaterasu for 50 minutes, and it's just this is such a complicated, every card is different. Suddenly every permanent is different from what other goddesses see a card as. It's just this card, it's complicated, so complicated. I mean, the ability doesn't seem that complicated, but when you really get into the nuts and bolts of it, it's so complicated. Right, back to the overall just deck overview, yeah? You've got the general idea as we've gone through all the deck pieces. I'm just going to give you a quick summary of Amaterasu in general, why the deck is the way it is. As you can see, Amaterasu likes to play big ball. there is no point having like these tiny little creatures that, you know, generate like 2, 3, 4 devotion generation. She's just not that chick. She's not interested in throwing it all on the board, generating a board, rushing you down, trying to get as much as possible. She's not going to do that. That's not how Amaterasu works. She's almost always losing in the early game, because she struggles to put things on the board, and everything she puts on the board is less efficient than just some default goddess, some blank goddess that puts the same unit on the board. Minotaur is worse for her, plain and simple. So you have to play big. You have to have like dig in, and you must have like these big ball cards like Armageddon, you know, Seaquake, even like your permanents like Fujin, Ningyo. These are actually like big ball, medium to large cards that have the potential to do everything for you. Absolutely everything. That's what Amaterasu needs, plain and simple. I hope I've explained this as well as possible. I really think you could play like Amaterasu like a million different ways. She's so abstract and weird and complicated, and the maths is just never simple with her. But I hope this at least has made it quite simple. I apologise for it being 55 minutes, but I really don't know how I could have ever explained this quicker. Like, this has been me trying to be as succinct as possible. I thought Hades took ages to explain. This is unreal though. Anyway, yeah, that's it. Sorry about the length.